Hey nerds, what's up? So today I want to talk about a subject that I have informally talked about in other videos, but have never made a dedicated video about. And that is how publishers, creators, showrunners, what have you, often learn the wrong lessons from really famous properties. Now, I've been thinking this for a while about a lot of different things, but like many of my video subjects recently, these thoughts have coalesced because of my recent foray into the fandom of A Song of Ice and Fire. Before I read the series, the only thing you would ever hear me say on main about mostly the Game of Thrones TV show was how I was worried that people were going to learn the wrong lessons from it. I would always say, people are going to think that the only way a fantasy show can be successful is if there is a lot of graphic violence, a lot of sex, or make it really, really adult. And honestly, now that I have read the books, I have never felt more correct. That statement aged perfectly, because more than ever, I am convinced that people learned the wrong lessons from why A Game of Thrones was so successful. So as I was making this video and I was kind of listing all of the wrong things people learn from popular properties, I started to realize that really it all circled back to a single point. And that point was that when the powers that be were trying to duplicate the success of these properties, they were completely removing the original from the context within it was created. Yet they were still expecting it to succeed in the same way. And surprise, it never seems to. So today we're gonna look at 3 very popular examples with The Hunger Games, A Song of Ice and Fire, and The Lord of the Rings, and we're going to examine how removing some of their successful elements from the context with which they were written means that all the copycats weren't as successful. So that's what we'll be talking about after the jump. So I'm going to start off with The Hunger Games, which I know I did cover a little bit in my strong female character video, but it's just such a good example to use. Now, if you weren't around in peak Hunger Games mania, understand that so many things were created to try to be a knockoff of particularly Katniss Everdeen. There was this influx of dystopian books with these strong female fighting leads, and it was just all over the place. I felt like you couldn't go to the theater without seeing a preview for a new one of these. They were everywhere, and just none of them were as successful. None of them reached the same fame. None of them were as good. Even the ones that got pretty famous ultimately failed. None of them replicated it. On the surface, yes, Katniss is a fighter. She dislikes typical femininity. She's emotionally reserved. She's strong. She's a go-getter. She's the symbol for the rebellion in her dystopian society. And many of the movies tried to directly copy these traits. So why weren't they successful? Well, simple. It's because they removed the Katniss character from the rest of their story. They never stopped to consider why Katniss was the perfect character for the situation she was in. The first example I can use is that Katniss never comes off as a pick-me. Now, that's a term we use a lot now. But a lot of the other characters that try to copy Katniss came off as not other girls. I have never heard anybody use that criticism against Katniss, despite the fact that she has some of those traits. Why? Simple, because Katniss's rejection of that femininity comes from her hatred of the Capitol. The Capitol is this oppressive force that is also completely over the top, and the ones trying to force her into this typical femininity. It makes perfect sense in her story why she would hate that, why she would reject it, why it would be so anti to who she is. It makes sense within the context of her story and really has nothing to do with other women. When you remove that context, that's when I think that character trait can sometimes fail. For a second point, it's also usually completely ignored that Katniss was not trying to become a symbol for the rebellion. She was not even trying to start a rebellion. She is thrust into it by her actions. She is kind of forced into being the symbol, and I feel like it's ignored how much that sometimes Katniss resents this role, finds it very difficult, was not choosing it for herself necessarily. And I think that sort of reluctance also gives a depth to Katniss's character that is often missing from the typical copycats. And although there are many others I could mention, the last one I want to bring up today is one that I swear is often overlooked, which is that the characters around Katniss and how they support her personality. My favorite example being Peeta. When you look at other YA dystopians, you'll notice that Peeta is a very atypical male character for these types of stories. Peeta works as a foil to Katniss. He is not, as skilled in fighting as Katniss. He is much more sensitive. He is much more in tune with his emotions. He plays a different role than Katniss, and so that they can work off each other and, make the story whole as they work together and try to figure out, those issues. And honestly, I think it is vital for grounding Katniss's personality within the story. But of all the other ones I've read and watched, you rarely ever see a Peeta male type character as a foil to a Katniss type female character. And I think it's really important in the story, and I think that's a lot of reason the copycats didn't work as well. So when we remove all that, and instead what we have left is, wow, everyone's going crazy for this fighter gal, let's just make a ton of dystopian fighter gals, we remove the heart of the story and why she worked. Katniss is a great character for her story. When you remove her from the context, it usually doesn't work as well. Actually, you know who's delivering really good, unique content? Today's sponsor, Campfire. Now, Campfire has been a sponsor on my channel before, and that's because I so believe in their mission and vision. But the last time I told you guys about Campfire, they were only available on web, but now I am happy to say that they recently announced a Campfire app to make reading books easier than ever. More than 300,000 authors and readers use Campfire to share and discover new and exciting fiction in so many genres, including my favorites, fantasy, sci-fi, and literary fiction. The cool thing about Campfire is that books come with extras like character profiles, interactive maps, exclusive short stories, and even a chance to engage directly with authors. You can save your favorites to your bookshelf, make custom collections to organize your TBR, and dive even deeper into the stories you love. And perhaps one of the reasons I love and support Campfire the most, authors earn higher royalties on Campfire than any other platform, so you know you're giving the best support to your favorite authors. You can get started right away by setting up a free account. I noticed that last year's SPFBO winner Olivia Atwater's newer book, The Witch Would Not, was on Campfire. So go ahead, make an account, choose the genres that you like to read, and cozy up with a new book. Stories come to life in a whole new way on Campfire. Click the link in the description to learn more. Okay, next, let's talk about A Song of Ice and Fire. Okay, I know that I haven't watched the show, but I've read the books. Okay, I've actually only read 4 of the 5 books, but it doesn't matter, leave me alone. Yes, I am not surprised Game of Thrones, the TV show, was a success. Yes, it does have shocking content. Yes, it is a very adult fantasy show. But once again, we are removing those elements from the context of the series itself. The biggest thing is that Martin writes amazing characters. He is probably one of the best at writing extremely complex characters that you love and you hate, and you start hating but then you love, or you love to hate. He writes these very intricate, real feeling characters. And when you have a show that's deeply rooted in character development, I feel like you can have shocking things and not overwhelm the story. Also, I have a hill that I will die on, which is the hill that George doesn't write shocking content just to be shocking. He's never doing anything just for shock factor. Every shocking moment in the series that I have read so far has been super supported by the character development. No character is ever acting in a way that doesn't seem typical of their character, in my opinion. Like, yes, that makes sense for what they do. Additionally, a lot of our really shocking main events, when you look back, had just like dump trucks worth of foreshadowing. He was telling us the whole time. We just were blind to it. So it's not like these events come out of nowhere. And the best example of this, in my opinion, obviously is the Red Wedding. Now, I'm not going to say any spoilers here, but I actually still distinctly remember when the Red Wedding episode aired, only because even though I wasn't watching the show, a ton of my friends were, and it was all anyone was talking about. Like, everyone was just like, oh my gosh, the Red Wedding, it was so disturbing, it was so terrible, it was so shocking, I can't believe it. Like, that's what everyone was talking about. And so when I actually got to that part in the book, yes, it was devastating. If you've been following my journey, you know I did not take it well. But one thing that did surprise me about that moment was that in my head, because of everything I had heard, I thought there was going to be like a massacre. I thought like 30 people were going to die. That's not the case at all. In fact, it's pretty much very few people, because it's not really the event itself that is so shocking. It is the way it happens. It is the way the characters react to this. It is the buildup of that moment. And once again, when you remove that context and just say, well, we killed some characters, so the red wedding was shocking and people loved it, so that's what we're gonna do, you're kind of missing the point. I feel these showrunners are like sexy times, shocking deaths that come out of nowhere. And those shows just never seem to work. Sure, I think people enjoy them in the short term. I feel like they don't have a lot of long lasting because when people take a step back, they're like, well, that didn't make sense for that character. While I feel frustrated that this event happened with no warning, I feel like that's not how they'd act because they've completely removed the fact that A Song of Ice and Fire at its core is a deeply character-driven book and thus becomes a deeply character-driven show. And so these shocking elements, while amazing in the context of that, once you remove the quality, then all they become is shocking moments that don't really matter. Okay, the last one I want to talk about today is The Lord of the Rings, but more specifically, the show Rings of Power and its relationship to The Lord of the Rings. I think Rings of Power is just such a good example of something that is trying to recapture the magic of a particular thing without really understanding why it worked in the first place. Now, I know that the Rings of Power had a lot of issues. I detailed many of them in my video covering the show, but I do think an element you can contribute to its lack of success is the way it tried to copy Lord of the Rings, but in a shallow way. The first example I want to talk about is the inclusion of the Hobbit storyline in Rings of Power. I said this in my previous video, but if you just completely removed the Harfoot storyline, it would not change the show at all. And there was just this feeling to me, the powers that be were like, well, people love hobbits, so you can't have a Lord of the Rings show without hobbits in it, even though it's the Second Age and the hobbits aren't really involved in the Silmarillion. They have to be there. Well, again, that's kind of removing the context of why the hobbits were so important in the main Lord of the Rings trilogy. There was some heavy thematic work about, the small, the ignored, the less powerful doing great things. We see it with the hobbits, the halflings, like that's the whole point, right? Frodo volunteering to be the ring bearer. It's the point of when we see Eowyn and Merry together, conquering big foes. That's a huge thematic element of the entire novel. It's not just, oh, hobbits are fun. It's a deeply thematically rooted purpose. So I think hobbits could have worked in the show if you had a reason for them to be there other than people like hobbits. And again, I know in my Rings of Power review, I displayed scenes side by side that were directly lifted from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I'm sure they were just trying to be homages to the original, and I totally can appreciate an homage. But what was so stark to me is how little those scenes worked in Rings of Power. I felt no emotional connection to those, whereas in the original, they were some of everyone's favorite moments. Again, it's because you can't just put the moment in there devoid of any story or context of why it's meaningful, of the character work that you have. At some point when I was watching Rings of Power, it felt like they thought that Lord of the Rings was successful because of hobbits and elves and Sauron. In general, I feel like some of our most successful works are because of thematically what they mean. And so if you don't have a pulse or a sense of what the theme of your work is, then it's always going to fall flat to a work that knows what it's trying to say. So some concluding thoughts here. I know that a lot of really popular things have a lot of luck, kind of lightning in a bottle, can never be replicated, of course. But I think there's something to be said about when themes are removed from these original works, when people ignore the context with which they are created and try to do cheap replicas. Again, it's probably hard to replicate anything, but I feel like if you really understand what a work is trying to do and are inspired by it, you can be successful. Honestly, the thing that I immediately thought of was The First Law. I know Joe Abercrombie was super inspired by George R.R. Martin and A Song of Ice and Fire. And I did read The First Law first, but as I've been reading A Song of Ice and Fire, I see his inspiration so clearly for The First Law. But The First Law is its completely own thing. The First Law actually, I believe, understood what A Song of Ice and Fire was doing and, you know, took some things from A Song of Ice and Fire and made it its own and understood that it was about characters and themes and what it was doing. And so it became its own thing. And I think that's like a great example of how you could find inspiration with something and want to try to kind of recapture some of that, but truly understanding what made it so popular in the first place. I think if you want to have staying power and be more than a flash in the pan, you have to truly understand why something is successful if you want to replicate any nature of it. So when I say that people, showrunners, what have you, are learning the wrong lessons, it's because they're just learning the easy lessons. They're looking at the surface of what the work is and aren't really digging deeper, in my opinion anyway. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think showrunners, publishers, writers are learning the wrong lessons? What are like properties you know that were inspired by others and that you think work really well? And you think it's because thematically they knew what was going on or because they really understand the work? I don't know. Tell me your thoughts below. And as always, if you like these kind of videos, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I am currently reading as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.